Pat?
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, and welcome for tonight's special first intergenerational conversation among Italian American women. Tonight, we're focusing on failure, vulnerability, and resilience. Our special speakers represent the baby boomer and millennial generations, and they co-host a company called Stilettos and Sneakers, where they explore how the cultural values we grew up with as Italian American families are passed down through the generations, and they help today's woman recognize how her heritage contributes to her present day strengths and weaknesses. First speaker I will introduce to you is Janice Zarro, our baby boomer, who is a NOIAW member and a former vice president of our organization. She is a lawyer, a former corporate and nonprofit executive. Her legal career began on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., and she then managed the federal, state, and international government relations operations for two major companies. She led a nonprofit for a decade dedicated to working with women seeking employment, education, and entrepreneurial opportunities. Janice is Nicole's great aunt. Nicole Spiotta has led a career in the athletic industry. I just want to say that Nicole represents our millennial generation, and she has led a career in the athletic industry for the past 11 years. Nicole has served as a head coach across all levels, including college for softball, and along with serving as an athletic administrator. Her professional experiences expand in youth sports and academic programming. So now I'm going to turn the program over to Janice, who will start and explain how this all came to be and how we can all benefit from their wisdom. Thank you, Janice.
This is the presentation we're going to give, but before I do, I want to just say how pleased Nicole and I are to be here and to welcome all NOIAW members and guests. Nicole and I are thrilled to share our experiences, our tips, and to share with you what we have learned as we study failure and the role that vulnerability plays in failure. I just want to say we're really excited because this is the first time we've made a presentation to an Italian American women's group. Our groups are usually not ethnic and they usually focus on the workplace, but we feel like we're home. So it's wonderful to be with you. We all experience failure, and we experience it personally and professionally. But just like unwanted pregnancies and monthly menstruation, we don't talk about the feelings associated with failure. So tonight, join Nicole and I as we, through Stilettos and Sneakers, an intergenerational conversation, turn the prism on failure and vulnerability, and we do it through sharing our experiences. So Nicole, you're the techie, so you can begin.
I'm on it. Hi, everyone. I'd like to just echo what my great aunt said, and thank you so much. We're really excited to have you not only join our conversation, but hopefully expand it a little bit more. The first slide that you'll see up tonight is called Connect with Us. We really have grown as a company and just through our messaging by connecting with people like you individually and through groups. And one way we've done that is hosting a number of different social media platforms. I will put this slide up again at the very end of our presentation, but this is really here for you all just to kind of see that we are on a number of different platforms, and really you'll be able to hear more of our writing and see more of the things that we have done to get to where we are today on our website at stilettosandsneakers.com. As we go through, we will talk from our different generational perspectives. As everyone knows, my Aunt Janice, she's going to be speaking from the baby boomers perspective, which is a range from the year 1946 to 1964. Generation X is from 1965 to 1980. The millennial perspective and that generation, which I'm speaking from, is the 1981 to the 2000s. And Generation Z is your 2001 to 2020. Stilettos and Sneakers has come to fruition by talking about ways that we can find common ground. Specifically, we focus on 8 topics, and we find ways to relate that to personal and professional experiences amongst women. And we try to grow our intergenerational conversation by highlighting these specific topics. And we've each written a personal blog on how these different topics have influenced us as women, both again, professionally and personally. So we'll talk about things like hard and soft skills, public and private failures, non-traditional women. And specifically to this group, how we can all relate to you is through the extended Italian American family. I'm going to have my aunt start us off here, but we're going to highlight a little bit about how the extended Italian American family has influenced us. And also, I would like to just point out, if you visit our website, you will be able to see our blogs in more detail on this topic. And you can also read our latest blog on our most recent family vacation, where our entire family was under one roof for a week celebrating after Christmas, the holiday. Go ahead, Aunt Jen.
I went through the various topics to elicit from each of them where I thought the Italian American influence really colored and shaped my experience. On non-traditional women, clearly I learned power as a child. My mother was a homemaker, and she managed the money. She told us what to wear, what to eat, and when we went to the dentist. And so I saw power inside the home from my mother. My father was a factory worker, but very involved in the union, very involved in the church, in the Catholic Church, and he was a coach. He brought stories to the dinner table and the outside world to the family. And so I saw power inside and power outside, and I liked both. So I became very comfortable with the concept of power. I had no brothers. I had just one sister, Judy. In fact, she's on this Zoom tonight. That's terrific, because what happened was there was no favoritism to the boy in the family. We were both told we could go to college and be anything we wanted. And I saw in other Italian families, as I was growing up, the boy, particularly if the family had limited resources, he was sent to college, or he was given some sort of training. The girls, they went to work, and it didn't matter if they wanted to go to college. So I felt very grateful I had no brothers. And so basically, a non-traditional woman, I became a non-traditional woman watching very traditional women, homemakers, nuns, teachers, and nurses. Under the life choices and expectations, I think it's important to point out, I was the first in my family to go to law school, male or female, and it's 1969. I get to law school, very few women. My career goes on, I'm often the first woman or one of few women. So that very much shaped the style that I developed. I had a commuter marriage. In the early 80s, when I was just married, this did not go over well, again, in the Italian American family. Under relationships, I would point out that I never wanted the Prince Charming, I never wanted really children, and I never wanted the white picket fence. So that there was clearly, again, developing very much a different type of image of the relationships I wanted. In summary, I would have to say that the expectations of my Italian American family at that time, I really felt I failed. And intertwine that with Catholicism, because we were a very devout Catholic family. And I was failing with their expectations because they were very black and white. And I lived in the world of gray, I still do. And so that was very much what I felt in many of the topics we talk about, that I was influenced by my Italian American upbringing. Nick?
My extended Italian American family blog title is "Oh, When the Saints Come Marching In." And I think it's very fitting because, you know, by no means are we all saints, but we always filed in as a crowd. And still to this day, even for our family vacation, when we would come in as families, we would all come together as groups. And one thing that has influenced me is being a part of a team, being a part of a group setting and understanding what it means to exist in that setting. And what it really taught me is how to find a seat at the table. There was always an abundance, and always will be, an abundance of love and support that my family demonstrated through Sunday dinners at my grandma's house or at sporting events, or if my brother was in a show, we would all go together. And I try to mirror that personally and professionally in all my relationships, understanding what it feels like to have that support right next to you, or if you needed to pick up the phone and call somebody, you had somebody there. With that had come a lot of unspoken expectations. And it was seen more so at the dinner table when these unspoken expectations of roles. For example, when we had Sunday dinner, my grandmother would always cook. All the men would always be downstairs watching sports. And when we'd all sit down for dinner, we would talk about the sporting event or the latest in the news, and my mom would serve everybody sitting at the table. It was roles that people were filling without anyone speaking about it. And I learned that coupled with a lot of opinions can be a little bit overwhelming at times. So it's important to be able to hear what everyone has to say and really find your own voice. And this really helped me learn how to articulate my own opinion, how to feel like I said, have a seat at the table. But I really feel like the key word here is authenticity. I learned to take advantage of every opportunity to prove one's authenticity. I specifically watch sports and followed sports so I can contribute to the conversation. I love listening to everyone's opinions on politics or what was happening in the news. I actually ended up majoring in political science. So it was things like that that taught me how to learn from a group, but also find oneself. So the big question is, why are we here today? A lot of things that we talk about with Stilettos and Sneakers, we try to make them as relatable as possible. The first thing that we really realized that Stilettos and Sneakers can bring to the conversation are coping skills to develop resiliency. And we've seen that and we reflect on that in a number of our different pieces, and also just in having interviews and one-on-one conversations.
I want to talk about that deep cut gut punch when you feel like you're suffocating, and share an experience. And that experience is when I was working for Avon Products, and many of you are New Yorkers. That was the cosmetic company. And in that 9 West 57th Street building, I was an officer in the company at Avon. I had a beautiful office on the executive floor, had all the benefits that go. I broke the glass ceiling. There were other women with me, but clearly it was a privilege. I was running a major operation in Washington, D.C., and I was running all their state and government relations. And my picture had just been in Fortune magazine. And in an instant, it was gone. When the general counsel flew in to Washington, D.C. to tell me my position would be eliminated, I was devastated. I was in Washington. Everything is your power and your title. That's your identity. I was humiliated. I isolated. I cried. I did not reach out to anyone. I handled the whole situation poorly. And what I remember from that experience was that nobody met me and what I was feeling. It was just go find another job. What's your problem?
One thing that Stilettos and Sneakers is we're not a platform that talks about how you turn a failure into a success. Something that I have learned throughout our time together, and I've also seen throughout my playing career as an athlete and then my professional career in athletics, is that it's being able to recognize that a failure is not necessarily a negative, and it's how we accept that we have failed and move from there versus taking that failure and turning it around into a success.
understanding failure and its causes is important, because I think for women particularly, we have those tapes that go on in our mind. Why didn't I see it coming? I'm not good enough. We continually personalize what this failure is all about, instead of really looking at what environment we're in, workplace or relationship, and what are the systemic causes that make us feel like it's our fault.
And my aunt said a great word is the personalization, right? We try to figure out, how do we remove that personalization? Especially in today's world, I'm sure a lot of you can relate to this. You have happy hours, you have social group settings where you are friends with your coworkers or your boss, and then something happens, right? That deep gut punch that my aunt referred to earlier. Those things happen, but how do we take the personalization out of it and separate ourselves and see the failure for what it is, and then move from there? Stilettos and Sneakers is really found on an intergenerational conversation. And we talk about our generational perspective.
And though this Stilettos and Sneakers focuses on baby boomers and millennials, and please understand, you know, Nikki and I are born decades apart, but we found that as we shared experiences, we were really bridging communication gaps. And this is really important in workplaces. If different generations of women can communicate, we can really bridge communication gaps.
And what we did to bridge that gap was we interviewed probably over 100 and maybe 150 different women of all different generations, not just specifically baby boomers or millennials. And what we did was we came up with tips and tricks for each topic. And you'll see at the end of our presentation tonight, we'll talk about some takeaways and ways in which that we reflect. But those interviews helped us not only have conversations with women of different generations, but that's where we found that common ground. And that's where we were able to kind of use those 8 topics to build that bridge between the communication gap.
Clearly, Nicole and I have common ground in the sense that we may use different words, or we use the same words, but they mean different things to us. And let me give you 2 examples. We spend a lot of time on discussing whether it's important to be liked or respected. Now, I'm a baby boomer. It is I never cared whether I was liked. It's in my DNA to be respected. Meet your goal. Make sure that piece of legislation's passed. Do what you have to do and be respected. That's not true for millennials. Millennials put a much high, and by the way, I want to say in retrospect, I paid a price for not being liked. And so I'm not sure that it's not a recommendation I have, it's just a sharing of my experiences of what I was and who I am and how I'm wired. And I think a lot of baby boomers are wired that way. So anyway, we're all about relationship building. Whereas I think millennials, you grew up in technology, and they, you know, how many times you're liked and whatnot, it's a very different concept. Let's talk about the word authenticity. And in fact, Nicole used it in the beginning of her talk. For those of you who have not read Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, I highly recommend you read it. It has a lot of valuable information. I just don't recommend that you do what she says, because if I was authentic in my professional career, said what I thought and believed in, I would have been fired. So I was clearly one person in my career. And then when I went home and was with friends, I was a different person. That is not what authenticity means to millennials today. They want to be the same person and be as comfortable and be the same person in their workplace as they are in their personal life.
And to expand on that just a little bit, I know that I had mentioned where the word authenticity also when it comes to my extended Italian American family. And what I have found was that the groundwork was kind of laid by the generations before me of women. And that authenticity that I found at the dinner table has now transferred into my everyday life everywhere, not just personally at my grandmother's house, but in my professional career. So it's interesting because I do feel like there has been a significant influence and a lot of groundwork laid by the earlier women and the earlier generations from my family that have really set me up to fully embrace authenticity and also understand what it means to its fullest. What we talk about at Stilettos and Sneakers is their personal experiences. Like I said, we have our website. You will go on and you can see a number of our different topics, a number of blogs, just, op-eds that we have written on topics, whether it's, relatable or not. And what's important for everyone on this Zoom call to understand is that understanding the insights, they're not academic or scientific. Yes, we do a lot of research, and I always like to point out that my aunt still reads the newspapers, cuts out the clippings of articles that relate to something we are talking about, puts them in an envelope, puts a stamp on it, and mails it to me, no matter where I am. And I still have a book filled with them. But we find those things that relate to it, but it's by no means academic or scientific when we're speaking about it. It's very personal. We revel ourselves in the findings on tips for coping from the women that we've interviewed. So we really focus on making the conversations ourselves, getting the opinions of others, understanding the personal experiences of others and ourselves and how they correlate. Stilettos and Sneakers, where it began and where it has taken us.
This all began with the defeat of Hillary Clinton. And I just want to preface my remarks by saying, this is not political, so it doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, whether you liked Mrs. Clinton or disliked her, whether you were for or against, but her defeat was devastating to me. And let me share with you why. I have spent my life mentoring. I still do today. I have taught business etiquette, and I taught a class in executive presence to women. In the mentoring in those classes, this is what I taught. Look the part, dress appropriately, be prepared, be over-prepared, be qualified. And when Mrs. Clinton was defeated, I felt, how can I go out there and tell this to younger women and teach this and share this? Because she, in my opinion, was all of that and failed. And you may say, well, it wasn't a fail, it was a loss of an election. Well, I'm pretty black and white. You win and you lose when it comes to an election. And this was a devastating loss. The second thing that devastated me, I had expected, naively so, of a kind of sisterhood to come together. And this is the baby boomer in me, when she was the candidate. And I saw exactly the opposite.
For me, I had a different perspective on why it was difficult for me to see Hillary Clinton lose the election. And I really honed in on my athletic experience in this moment, trying to understand the measure of success. Was losing in this moment considered a failure? My aunt, and according to her and her generation, feel like, yes, it's black and white, right? We lose, we fail. But being on a sports team, there's a number of times where you lose, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you failed. You could have played the best game of your life and the other team was just better that night. And for me, what was hard was I did not feel as measure of success was clear. I felt like we had a woman who was in such a limelight of presence, but the success wasn't measured in the same capacity that it was and has been in the past. And that made me really think also and bring into the point on the slide you'll see here, how aware are we of implicit biases amongst the different generation of women, leadership, their styles. My aunt and I looked at it and we both saw it as a different form of failure, but our implicit biases, did they influence that? What barriers are we responsible for putting up based off of our generation and our generational perspectives?
And I want to really address the issue of implicit biases and talk about, and this is a directed, if you will, not at the millennials, but I deal with a lot of women who are baby boomers and older, and you may be out sitting on this Zoom call right now. You have hiring and firing authority. You may sit on a nonprofit board of directors or a corporate board. You may be the managing partner of a department of some kind. But I hear implicit biases. And what are they? Oh, she doesn't, for younger women, she doesn't dress appropriately. She's in your face. She doesn't, she's a disruptor. She doesn't come in here and want to learn the institutional rules and the history. She has all those tattoos. She has rings in her nose. And then this is the one that's really going on that I think is very disturbing. And it's not talked, it's in the workplace right now. And this is between women who have had their children and have raised their children and women who are now younger and having children. And there's kind of a thing where, well, I raised my children and I didn't have a daycare center, or I didn't have medical family paid leave. Why should we be accommodating the younger women now? And so we get these implicit biases against each other. And what happens when generationally, I think we do that, is we thwart our collective power and the kind of change that we can do.
One point I do want to highlight is the implicit bias based off of attire and presentation of oneself has significantly changed. And I do always like to point out that you could see us now when you see our videos, the way that my aunt dresses and presents herself and the way that I dress and present myself. And sometimes we both look in different generations, and I will look at my aunt and say, she's a baby boomer. I could see it, right? I can see it in the way she carries herself. I can see the way she dresses. Forget about look of as far as her age, but just the way she presents herself. And I feel like the same can be said vice versa. The way that I would walk into a quote, business professional meeting might be a little bit different. And those biases, they do influence us. And it's what we try to do is find the common ground behind those biases to kind of keep the biases aside so that we can find our common leadership styles and how we can actually work together and create a supportive environment versus a separate one.
Yeah, and I just want to add before we leave this just happened last week. I am as guilty of even though I'm so conscious of it, this is just what I did last week. I had the opportunity on a nominating committee I wanted to get a woman of color in the mix. And I had coffee with a woman who was just very knowledgeable. I live in Sarasota, Florida, and I wanted some names. So she began giving me names of people that I could recommend. And I, across the table, is saying, well, they don't have she doesn't have organizational savvy. Now, she's not, I dismissed every one of those candidates. Finally, this woman looked at me and said, you wouldn't do this to a guy. You want the perfect candidate that you want to put forward there. And it was like a big pail of water right in my face, because that's exactly what I was doing. It was just that implicit looking for that perfection. I had to throw that in. That just happened 2 weeks ago.
So this is the where it took us part. Go ahead, Andrea, and you're starting this one off.
Yeah. It was clear that the feeling of failing, and this particularly came out through the interviews that we did. A lot of the interviews that I had with women talked about going through a divorce and what a failure that felt like. And nobody really met them at the moment. It was years later that they could really reflect on it. And we're trying in Stilettos and Sneakers to really help women when they are experiencing the failure in the moment, what might be the best way to cope with it so that we can alleviate some of the pain.
We really began to focus on failure through personal experiences, and that's how those 8 topics that we had mentioned in the beginning were really developed. And what I find interesting is that over the past 5-6 years, even though we started our focus with failure, that conversation led to the discussion of vulnerability. And we found a lot of commonalities between the two. And we know we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, but it's interesting how the more we spoke to different generations of women, the more the conversation grew in towards the direction of how vulnerability ties into failure.
And our goal in Stilettos and Sneakers is that we learn from each other. The generations learn from each other, listen to each other, and then develop the courage and resiliency to handle failure.
And we believe that women who participate in these types of conversations like you all today, you'll develop better professional and personal resiliency. It's another word keeps coming up. You'll see there's a lot of commonalities in some of the words we use, but that's because we have found that women we have spoken to or we've interviewed with, they take that step back and that second look at things now that they've joined us in this conversation. So like I said on this last slide, was we ended up shifting from failure and then adding vulnerability to our conversation. We are both big fans of Brené Brown. Not sure how many of you have heard or read any of her books. Dare to Lead. I'm about to finish Atlas of the Heart. I think she does a fantastic job really diving headfirst right into the word of vulnerability. And despite what some may think, Brené Brown has said this, and this is how she quotes vulnerability. Vulnerability is our most accurate way to measure courage, and we literally do that as researchers. Vulnerability allows them to assess fearlessness, and we can measure how brave you are by how vulnerable you're willing to be. If you have not read anything or watched any of her TED Talks, I highly recommend listening in, because she does do a great job on discussing vulnerability, picking it apart. And my aunt and I have found how it really is relatable to coping with failure and understanding it to its fullest.
Common ground. After much of the work we've done and the continuing interaction that we have with groups like this, we came to the conclusion that the common ground that we can agree on are three things: soft skills, vulnerability, which I'll talk about just as Nicole did, and some unspoken expectations. What do I mean by soft skills? Now, they mean very different things to Nicole than it means to me. And this has a great deal to do with her background. I grew up in a blue collar, modest financial, I guess we were poor, but you don't know it, in Newark, New Jersey, in a 2-story rental sort of tenement. I had no lessons. There was no discretionary income for lessons in anything. I can't swim. I don't ride a bike. I saw my father on union picket lines. And every summer, my activity was to go to Camp Stoop. You know what Camp Stoop is? You sit on the stoop and you watch the neighborhood go by. And that was every summer of my childhood. So when you talk about soft skills for me, they were really social skills that I had to learn and develop. I had to learn how to write a thank you note, which fork, spoon to use in the appropriate setting. When you ride on the corporate jet, where do you sit when the CEO? So soft skills for me are social skills. Now let's go to Nicole. Nicole grew up in an upper middle class background, always in a home, lots of lessons for everything you could think of. First of all, she goes to summer camp when she's 10 or 11 years old in upstate New York, and every summer thereafter. She has lessons in everything from sports to ballet, though she throws a hissy fit. You could read her story in, well, I don't know, how old were you, 4, 3, 5? You threw a little tantrum or hissy fit in ballet, no more for you. But clearly, though she believes soft skills are important, it is not the same thing, and it is not the same definition by any means. Now, vulnerability. Now, I'm going to confess to you, as I did before, I'm a baby boomer. And this baby boomer, when you initially, I dealt with the word vulnerability, that spelled weakness to me. You don't share that in a workplace. You don't show that in a relationship because it's somehow some sort of weakness. I don't believe that now. I truly don't. I think vulnerability is extremely important. Knowing when to show it on a team, not having to work at the solution, but collectively defining the problem. And I will share on a personal note, I really had 3 years ago, when my husband of 43 years died, I learned vulnerability the hard way, because I learned that to get through grief, you have to be vulnerable. You have to show it. And finally, Nick, do you want to share vulnerability from a sports angle?
I found that, you know, there was a way to learn how to basically control and present your vulnerability. One thing I will say is that from a millennial perspective, I do believe millennials find failure if they're not vulnerable enough, or they don't have the proper balance of vulnerability, since it was such a presence in the time in which we grew up. And I find that a lot of time in sports, that if you're overly vulnerable and you don't find that balance, you could easily become one of the weaker teammates. So it's important to be able to fully understand and embrace vulnerability so that you can serve your team in the best way possible. But it's also important to make sure that you know that there is a time for it, and there's a time where if you let your vulnerability take over your mental state and your mental approach to the game, then that could end up hindering you more so in the long run. So I've learned from a sports perspective that it's really important to find that great balance. And I think it's something that I enjoy working on every single day, trying to find the good and the bad of vulnerability, and understanding how to let it really fully support me and help me grow into my authentic self.
And finally, unspoken expectations. We've touched on this before, Nikki and I, in other ways, but really, for me, it was those unspoken expectations of the Italian American family, of my generation. I wasn't a fit, and I wasn't making it in that sense. And the Catholic Church, I didn't understand why women couldn't be priests, and I became pro-choice. So there was a lot of things that I didn't fit the expectations. And the final story I'll share is my sister was graduating college when I was about to enter college. Now she's graduating, she graduated an all-girl Catholic college in New Jersey, which was to the delight of my parents. And they were very much assuming and wanting me to follow in her footsteps and go to this same Catholic all-girl college. I, of course, chose the state university and went to Rutgers University instead. And now this is 1969. So I'm out in the streets protesting, and it was the Vietnam War, it was the women's movement. So didn't meet that expectation very well.
Takeaways. We love takeaways. It allows for us to not only reflect on what we've said, but it allows for us to really take a look at what we've heard and how we can grow with each conversation.
I think to hear and see and value women where they are, it doesn't mean in your heart you really want to see this younger woman, millennial, advance. In your heart. Enough with the heart. What are your actions? Not what you're saying, but what you're doing. And so this is all about the actions.
I know we spoke about the implicit biases earlier, but it's one major takeaway that we have found, especially working together, seeing how we both present ourselves and are from the different generations, is being aware of those implicit biases when judging the behavior, leadership styles, and appearance of women of different generations. This can directly correlate to anybody in the workplace or even professional or personally. We all have implicit biases. It doesn't make you a bad person. It's very natural. But when judging the behavior and the leadership of another woman of a different generation, it's important to understand and be empathetic of their generational background, their generational experiences, and really finding more of a common ground versus the differences. And with that, communication is key when confronting a failure. I have learned throughout my athletic career and just working in sports that without communication, it is very difficult to fully understand a situation and actually find success in it. When confronting a failure, it is important to completely talk through all of it, whether you're talking through it with another person or even if you're talking through it with yourself. That communication aspect is critical in really understanding how to cope with the failure that you've experienced. Having the ability to communicate with yourself and others is really key to understanding and experiencing an evolution of yourself from failure. So what I have seen here is that communication really helps you not only evolve, but it really helps bridge that gap too between the different generations. Finding a balance. What does balance look like for you? And we're going to add this in here post the COVID pandemic. So for me, something that I have always tried to work on has been finding a balance between all the different things that I do, both personally and professionally. What does that look like though, now that we are post-COVID, right? We are able to be involved in a number of different things. We're able to do a lot of different things that we haven't been able to do. Are we treading the water lightly or are we going full force? So trying to create a balance. One thing I will say from a millennial perspective is I'm gonna take the word multitasking, the phrase multitasking. And what we're able to do is we're able to get up at 7 in the morning, have our coffee, make our smoothie, make sure we have a good breakfast, maybe scroll through social media for an hour, check some emails, and then work really hard for about 2 to 3 hours. Then we'll have lunch and maybe we'll go with a coworker, and then maybe we'll run home to let our dog out, and then we'll come back and we'll, have a couple of meetings, do some presentations, scroll through social media, then meet a friend out for happy hour, and then we'll go home and we'll do some Netflix and chill. To us as millennials, that is a balance, right? For some people like baby boomers, that might be you're taking a lot of hats on and off, on and off, on and off, because what I have seen is that it's difficult for baby boomers to find a balance between doing all those different things, because in their generation, they have found where they wake up, they go to work, they come home, they have dinner, they have family time, whatever the case may be. But it's a lot more structured versus the millennials. Their balance looks like having a little bit of everything throughout their day makes them feel like they've really found that balance and they feel whole.
The concept of power is just so exciting to me. Seizing power, analyzing it structurally and systemically, and creating the appearance of power. If I could have my way, I would start teaching women about power in high school, college, law school, MBA programs, Masters of Education programs, because this is really, to me, what is so important for not only advancing women in their career to understand the power structure they're in, up against, a part of, but also in relationships. I worked for a decade with women getting a second chance, and there was no question that how one understands money in a relationship, it's a part of the power of a marriage or a partnership. And so I think that I get upset when people say, well, I don't want to talk about power. It's like, don't use the word failure. People don't want me to use the word power. Power is terrific, to understand it, to use it wisely, and to advance an agenda. But we as women really have to work, I think, at understanding this.
That concludes our presentation for this evening, and we would really love to hear from all of you. As I said in the very beginning, Stilettos and Sneakers has grown into what it is because of a conversation, especially an intergenerational conversation. So if you have any questions, we would really love to hear from all of you and kind of expand on what we've already spoken about.
Thank you so much for that. Just like Janice said, I think, success is easy to talk about, failure, not so much. That takes humility and strength. So I'm looking here at the chat. Celia earlier said, why call it a failure when a man would claim that a dismissal from the company was them just going after him? So that's a good point.
Yeah, I think that's related to the Avon experience I shared. It was what I felt and what I often feel. It's gotten better, certainly as I've gotten older. But yes, it was probably a business decision. I think a man would have reacted, oh, it was his fault, or the boss was this or that. I think women personalize it. We have those tapes. Oh, I didn't see it coming. What did I do wrong? I should have done this. I should have done that. I had a great, I always struck with me when my husband had a big meeting or a big presentation or something big. I would go and say, he'd come in the door and I'd say, how'd you do? He had no problem saying, I was great. I have never been able to say that in my life. I said, well, I should have done this, or I could have done that, or this could have been better. And I think that's the way I did why I considered losing that major position, which I just loved, a failure.
Yeah. Betty's asking, who are your clients or people you meet with?
I'm sorry?
Betty is asking, who are your clients or people that you meet with?
We meet with primarily it's who takes an interest in your topic and who reaches out to you. So for example, we did a major presentation with an international women's group, but we did it very differently. And I spoke with Pat about this. I don't think it could have been arranged here, but it was fascinating. We had women come from this group organization that the price of admission was to bring a woman of a different generation. So we had a mixture of millennials, Gen Xers, and baby boomers and older. And then we did breakout groups. So right now, you'd all be divided up into breakout groups with a leader. And we have very specific questions about that could be addressed. Then when the groups came back, the leader of the group did a report back, and it was fascinating. And I think some of it is up on YouTube. I have reached out to younger women from, I just did a thing at the University of Tampa where we talked about a lot of the issues of stilettos and sneakers. So it's varied.
We also did a guest podcast with Ann Doyle, who was the author of Powering Up. And as far as our interviews are concerned, we tried to outreach to not only people who we knew personally, but either friends of friends or people through our professional experiences, so that we could get different generations to contribute to the conversation, but also different industries. Because I know my aunt speaks from a corporate lawyer environment from her professional experiences, and I speak from solely just an athletic and a youth program education environment. So it was good to see people who work in different environments, or if they have other things that they seek professionally, and that we were able to kind of collaborate all together.
Great. We have several people that are saying that they were involved in sports. Like Aileen said that she decided to play baseball. Joanne said that she played co-ed softball for Pfizer for 22 years. Let's see, we have another question. How, from Deborah, how do you make sense of differences and similarities at different ages, regardless of generation? What's a common among 40 years over time, for example?
How do I make sense of the similarities?
Differences and similarities at different ages, regardless of generation.
That's interesting. I haven't thought about that.
I can speak a little bit about, I'm gonna go reference back to our opinion on vulnerability. I feel like there was a clear difference on that specific topic when we first, even 5 years ago, when we first started talking about it. And over time, we found that it wasn't necessarily the difference of opinion that was, what we found was there was actually a similarity in that it all related back to us personally and to failure. So we took that difference of opinion and we took the difference of our standpoint on what vulnerability is, how to approach it, how we use it, how we don't. And we found through talking about it and through our different personal experiences of where we saw vulnerability in action, or where we personally put vulnerability into action. And we related that back to, hey, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about, we started this conversation with failure. And I think that through those conversations over time, and even now, I have a different perspective on vulnerability and how I use it in my everyday than I did when I was in college. I think that we've, regardless of the generation, we found the similarity through the conversation growing and relating it back to failure.
I want to take it from the issue of mental illness, because one of the things we are looking at, and Nicole and I are talking about this, is I think I'm so proud of millennials and how they've really owned the issue of mental illness, where they're bringing it right out there, whether it be in the workplace or in the home. And I think there are now generations, you talk about where are the similarities regardless of generation. I really think as we look at mental illness in the school system, and the lack of resources, or our own society, I think regardless of where your generation is, you're coming at mental illness in a new and a very different and with much more awareness. We're talking about, look at what athletes and the young athletes and how courageous they've interrupted their career in terms of mental illness. So that's another issue that begins to bring similarities regardless of the generations that you represent. I hope that answered your question.
Speaking of millennials, Lynn said, I think we have a lot to learn from millennials and the workforce regarding work-life balance. I admire their desire and commitment to living a fulfilled life.
We just did a video, or I just did a video. I haven't seen Nicole's piece of it yet, but I'm not calling it work-life balance anymore. I'm calling it work-life harmony. I mean, there's really no balance implies 50% here, 50% there. That isn't it at all. It's bringing that harmony into every aspect of your life, work, family, finances, every piece of it. And I agree. I think it's healthy, and it's a step forward for society.
And it certainly has changed post-COVID. I know that we had spoken about that earlier, but what a balance and harmony looked like, pre-COVID is very, very different post, because we're all navigating through uncharted waters.
Mm-hmm. Betty is asking, are there any male groups like yours?
I don't know.
I don't know. I have no idea. Let us know if anybody discovers one.
The foursome out on the golf course this weekend, maybe that might be.
Well, I see. I'm just going to say, if I don't see any more questions right now, we have time for one or two more. If anybody else wants to, or you can raise your hand or put it in the chat, but I think we're probably going to be closing off soon. And before you do, I forgot to introduce myself in the beginning. I'm Pat Tinto, president of NOIAW. And I'm thrilled to have presented this program tonight with Nicole and Janice. I learned a lot, and it really explains some of the things that we've been talking about with NOIAW and re-examining our own mission were words that came out tonight, but just looking at the sisterhood and how we hear and value each other and women and empowering other women to support them where they are, not we expect them to be, or where they can be. So this has been a great presentation. And for those of you who aren't members, I hope you'll join us. You go to our website, NOIAW.org. Charity will put in the box. And by the way, charities are coordinated programs, and our staff member in the office in Manhattan. And if you call the office, you'll get her or Amanda. And if you are a member, just check to see that you're active and you're still on our mailing list, and we'd love to keep you engaged and make any suggestions that you have. Are there any other new questions? No? So then I would like to thank our speakers and a couple of our board members I see on, Aileen and Betty, Maria. It's great to see you here tonight, and plus some of the other members. Camille came in from Florida. I'm glad that we have a couple of people from Florida, of course, not just New York City, or we have New Jersey probably represented. But please, this great opportunity to meet with each other on Zoom. We hope to be resuming a lot of new in-person programs in our different regions. And then I'll just want to turn it over to Janice and Nicole if there's anything they'd like to talk about about their program before we end it, and any kind of upcoming events we should know about.
Just that I'm so pleased to still be a member of NOIAW, and I'm pleased to see it growing, and a tribute to Aileen Syrie for founding it and including me on it many years ago. And but I would just say, follow us on Stilettos and Sneakers and LinkedIn and all of the platforms that we're at. And let's talk to each other generationally as women, because I think that communication and that understanding each other is just so critical in bridging that communication gap.
Thank you all very much for letting us be a part of your evening tonight. We really appreciate it. And I know I can confidently say that this conversation will continue to grow, and you'll see us, like Mayanne had said, on our social media platforms, on our website. You'll see once this is completed, we'll be able to post tonight's recording. We'll also have some exciting things like a newsletter and some new blogs coming from Stilettos and Sneakers. So we really appreciate you joining us tonight. We hope you continue to do so.
All right, well then, thank you again.